Assalamu alaikum. This is Critical Talk hosted by Professor Amina Al-Din, and I have with me two wonderful professors, both of whom are friends of mine, and we're going to talk about cultural sea change. Today with us we have Professor Zarina Greenwald, who is an historical anthropologist and a documentary filmmaker whose research focuses on race, gender, religion, nationalism, and transnationalism across a wide spectrum of Muslim countries. Her book is a is Islam. No, it's not. It's Islam is a foreign country. I've read this book 3 times. American Muslims and Global Crisis of Authority. She is, I can't read all of the Bible, it's too much, but she has a forthcoming book on it that's titled, Is the Quran a Good Book? Oh, that's a bound to, you just don't know, raise some problems. And she is an associate professor at Yale. Also with us is Professor Sylvia Chan Malik. She's an associate professor in the Department of American and Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. She talks, teaches, and writes about the intersections of race, gender, and religion with a focus on the history and cultures of Muslims and Islam in the United States. Her books includes Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam. Um, she's written in a number of anthologies, including the Routledge Handbook of Islam in the West and the Cambridge Companion to American Islam. And she is working on a number of things, including gardening. Ha. Assalamu alaikum and good morning, ladies.
Walaikum
We
assalam.
have, you all can do a lot to teach me stuff. This morning, I have been, of course, concerned with this cultural sea change or an apparent cultural sea change. Are we seeing an extension of already formed patterns? Black folks have been getting killed in this country for 400 years, either being strung up by the neck or with a key on the neck or with bullets through a door. Is this a continuation of a pattern or is it indeed a cultural sea change?
Mhm.
Either one of you can jump in and take away. You all know a lot about this stuff.
Zarina, do you mind if I? So first of all, thank you so much, Sister Amina, for having us on to talk on this very, difficult and challenging and heartbreaking time for so many people in this country. However, as I've spoken to students, community members, people in my own family, what is emerging in the conversation is that while we are heartbroken at this and at the racist violence of police brutality and all that's going on, many have also told me that they are inspired and heartened by the kind of outpouring of protests and new forms of thinking that are emerging, not just within Muslim communities, but within, kind of larger society. So a few things that I just have noticed as someone who studies social movements in this country is, first of all, a very different understanding of the police's role. I think Black and brown communities have long known that police presence in the community is not friendly. It is not something you feel good about. There is a very different relationship with the police between Black and brown communities than other communities. And that seems to be shifting, right? I'll lower my chair. And so that is something that I sense happening now that is new, that I've witnessed, that literally the Minnesota City Council. There's a legislator there who's actually talking about possibly, disbanding the police and starting over again, trying to build new forms of community, engagement with law enforcement. And so that to me is something new and might be the start of the topic of the show, a sea change in terms of how people are understanding the state's role and the state as as something that perpetuates violence in Black and Brown communities and in American society as a whole.
Dr. Zarina?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sylvia brought up similar the points that I would have I'm just kind of underlining what she said, but I guess I think that what is there's people keep bringing various historical examples to compare this moment to, and then there's also the frustration being voiced again and again about how in certain ways there is history is not. I think Naomi Klein said this, that history is not cyclical, it's cumulative, and so we're building on the past, and there are of course many historical examples to be instructive, but there's also new things and new conditions, including operating with a much more expansive, intrusive security state, surveillance state than existed in the past. I mean, of course, there was COINTELPRO and other forms of surveillance and in the past as well, but with just the degree of it. And part of also, I think, the mobilization is supported, but also hurt in ways and undermined by these tools that we have. So, I mean, people being in quarantine and social media in some ways drew a lot of attention and kind of forced, let's say in particular, white populations in this country that maybe normally don't pay attention to this kind of violence, state violence. They were kind of forced to reckon with it because they're at home and they're on their social media accounts and they're watching more TV because they're not at work. So that's one piece of it. There's also, of course, those tools get used to help organize campaigns, organize protests. But then, of course, we also know that those things easily get co-opted and are also used against protest movements and resistance movements. So I think
I think you both mentioned something critically important. Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism is one aspect, but you all have brought to the fore this other more heightened cultural surveillance. And I think Muslims have encountered much of that after 9/11 with informants and all of these kinds of things. Are we seeing an extension of that? Is this a new kind of cultural surveillance? I mean, if we could call it that.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain what you mean by cultural surveillance? Do you mean
I'm trying to think. I'm talking to two anthropologists. I'm not an anthropologist.
No, she's an anthropologist.
Okay. I'm trying to think. Back to historical moments in history across the world, where when you see the rise of autocracy and you see the deployment of the intelligence forces on the population of whomever it is that wishes to become the autocrat. So here in the United States, we have our wonderful president, Mr. Trump, who is scared to death, and his recourse is to get members of the white militias that vote for him out there in uniforms with no name, no insignia, so you can't tell who they are. Some of the prison guards, to add to forces who will not only protect him, but they're protecting an ideology, right? And then we have all these black and brown bodies standing there trying to figure out what to do. If they move against non-legitimate forces, then both have, the legitimate and the non-legitimate, have a reason to move on them. if we're clearly in the pathway toward autocracy, what does that do to culture? What does it do to specifically Muslim culture, people in from other places, Muslims who have run away from autocracies to come to the land of freedom?
Mhm. Mhm. If
Go
it's okay.
ahead.
No, so as you were talking, I think what's other, when we're talking about what is shifting or what is interesting that is emerging from this moment. I mean, so 9/11 was a watershed. I always tell, folks that I don't think 9/11 changed everything. All the mechanisms that came into place after 9/11 in terms of state surveillance and state violence, those have been going on for some time. The apparatus that kicked in kind of,
With the Patriot Act.
Excuse me?
With the Patriot Act.
Exactly. All those types of things that got amplified after 9/11 had already been in place since the 1960s and 70s, when the state came and cracked down on civil rights and Black Power activists, right? All of those types of law and order mechanisms had already been in place. But what 9/11 did was it catalyzed those, and it kind of poured gasoline on them and lit a match, right? So that they were all kind of amplified. And what happened in that moment is that Muslims, and we all know, in this conversation, that Muslims are an incredibly motley, diverse, ideologically kind of like, disparate group, right? And long story short, you have African American Muslims who have been in this country for decades, if not centuries, thinking about their presence, who have engaged Islam historically as a type of liberation theology, who have engaged it as a critique of state power, who have engaged it as a critique of racism. And then you have newer immigrants or arrivals, from South Asia, from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, et cetera, from North Africa, who are coming to America, as many immigrants do, as a land of opportunity and possibility. So they have a very different understanding. So when 9/11 happened, what it did was catalyze many of these non-Black Muslims into understanding that they too were, subject to this.
I know, again.
That they were subject to it in a way that they had not, maybe been aware of, but not been so aware of in a daily, embodied material sense. And so what's happening now, once again, which I think is interesting, is that once again, you have issues of race and anti-Blackness coming up within the broader Muslim community, as a central subject that must be dealt with, right? And it is always kind of, like this moment, right? Again, I think for Muslim communities, about what position are you going to take in relation to the state after the experience that you've been through? And people are traumatized by this surveillance you speak about, traumatized. Surveillance on their communities that have gone on for decades, or just for the last decade. And it's a kind of moment in which I think people are really searching their hearts to say, what is my relationship to the state? As a Muslim, as a person of color, as a person of faith, right? Do I see this state as immoral? And if I do, how do I exist and benefit from it? So I think all of these questions are coming up within Muslim communities, and I see people kind of grappling with how to talk about them and how to articulate it. So, I mean, I think that is part of the effects of this cultural surveillance that's been happening, for almost 2 decades now.
Dr. Zarina, chime in here.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really troubling topic for many reasons. So, I mean, of course, September 11th, as Sylvia said, didn't introduce anything new. I mean, anti-Muslim racism is much older than that, and but it certainly amplified it. And so we can think about September 11th as being what is a biopolitical event, to use a kind of Foucauldian jargon. But coronavirus is also a biopolitical event.
Exactly.
And one of the things that's happening in pandemic of COVID-19 is that it's been a moment, as in crisis, where all different new things become possible, bad, good, new things. We were talking about kind of abolitionist politics before, but also regressive policies. And so one of those has been a proposal to roll out even another form of CVE in Muslim communities in this crisis moment. That's what's coming from the federal government.
Would you explain CVE?
Yeah, so countering violence extremism. They're a kind of counterterrorism program that was really about surveilling and policing Muslim communities. In fact, Minneapolis, by the way, was of course one of the pilot cities for this program. And the way it works is to essentially incentivize communities, Muslim organizations, mosques, Muslim institutions, to accept grants and then to participate with the state and work with the state on surveilling their the people in the communities. So there was a lot of grassroots work in Muslim communities to resist, to call out Muslim organizations who, for example, took the money and made these agreements, who attended these meetings. What are we agreeing to? And also one of the things that's really important to remember is that the surveillance of Muslims, like, so for example, LA is one city where we could see clearly that as these surveillance programs that are in name intended to surveil Muslims, what it actually does is it aggravates and increases policing of brown and black communities in LA, who may some of whom are Muslim, many of whom are not. So Muslims become the alibi for expanding what is already a racist policing structure in various cities across the U.S. So one of the things sort of that happened is, in all the chaos of COVID-19, is you have this proposal to rename, rebrand, but essentially expand another CVE program, and there hasn't been focus on that because we don't know all the details. It hasn't been a kind of point. But I also want to say that, this is, of course, intersecting with a larger debate that is about the pandemic and surveillance. So many of the people who are uncomfortable with state surveillance or resist or opposed to state surveillance are possibly open to surveillance when it comes to public health thing, like, should we be tracking who has a fever and who's been tested positive or not? I'm actually right now a fellow at PRI, and they're actually trying to track to see, is there some overlap here between the people who are, of course, COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting minority communities, Black communities,
right.
And so there's a desire, therefore, for that, given that urgency, for people to say, okay, we really need to, be willing to kind of, really track the disease, and maybe that requires some kind of public health surveillance. That's a question. It's an open debate, right? The same communities that, of course, want to resist the surveillance that's tied to policing and, of course, state violence. So, and then on the other side of it, of course, are the, let's say the Trump supporters, the white, the people who want to end the quarantine and want to get out of their houses so they can, I don't know, get a haircut or get, a beer, whatever it is. And they're, showing up at legislative bodies with weapons and all this. They had, their protests didn't have the same effect as the protests we're living through right now, in terms of galvanizing people to the streets, despite the frustrations of quarantine that we all feel. But what's interesting is they, of course, are normally totally fine with the policing from the state, and specifically the policing of minority communities. But they are resistant to the idea of being, surveilled when it comes to this public health issue. So, COVID-19 didn't start as a culture war issue, and the face masks and all this are the things that then sort of made it fall along those lines. If you look at like the polling data at the very beginning in March, when people were first going at home, there wasn't really this polarization of people who opposed the quarantine versus those who, along like Republican, Democrat, or something, or some kind of polar responses. There was a sort of more consensus. But then as it's amplified, and as Trump's rhetoric has increasingly framed it as, are you one of the good ones, i.e. with me, or are you one of these people that aren't really legitimate Americans, you've seen a polarization. So the question of surveillance looks really different whether you're looking at it from kind of the 9/11 point of view to now, right? So from 9/11, the Patriot Act to CVE as it exists today. And of course, we can go further back. We don't have to start with 9/11. Or whether you're looking at it from this public health debate, which is also about race and class. I mean, so these are both biopolitical.
Yeah, and I think we need to consider how all of this has become a different kind of cultural war. One of the things, I woke up this morning to a BBC report on Pakistan, and I forget the prime minister there's name, but he was saying that poverty is worse than coronavirus. Many in the streets here in Black and brown bodies are saying, you're letting us die of coronavirus anyway. So what is I might as well be out here and have potentially an experience at herd immunity, because we're dying in our homes. Our homes are not the best homes to shelter in. Our communities have no food. Things are being barricaded off, and quickly Black and brown communities were barricaded off. White communities were police protected. A different understanding of class and its accesses to racism. One of the other things I noticed was, uh, while we have the last straw that broke the camel's back was that of George Floyd. Simultaneously, almost, Breonna Taylor's home was being invaded and shot down. But it's been a fight to bring her to the fore, because here was a woman who did nothing except be in her house. But we have some kind of undercurring, annoying gender issues going on. And what we're going to look at, if we were to look at historically the issues of Black people and brown people in this country, we would have to notice a difference in who gets the press. Is it the male Black body or is it the female Black body? Shouldn't it just be Black bodies? Or are we doing another kind of cultural thing? I noticed that George Floyd's memorial service yesterday, there was an effort to speak about all of the tragedies and ongoing. I mean, they drug a Black woman out of her car in the lot of some mall yesterday, and they actually put their knee on her neck and were beating her. And someone captured it on film, which was great. But now they're I don't know what's going on. I need you ladies to help us figure out. On the other side, Muslim communities have the audacity to decide whether or not it enters this conversation. They have scriptural exhortations to do something about injustice, and they're sitting back as if I expose myself, I go back to 9/11 surveillance, or perhaps somebody might want to deport me, or this or that. What is going on?
I mean, there's so much wrapped up in that. And I actually would defer to you, Professor McLeod, in terms of thinking about the sea change in what you're I mean, in terms of, you've been working and writing and thinking and researching, the American Muslim community for so long in terms of this. So I would love to hear your thoughts about what you see as shifting and how you're making sense of it. So first of all,
that's not fair. I'm interviewing you.
I hope that we can, that we can hear from you, and then, of course I have thoughts about it. But there's so much kind of wrapped up in that. I did want to say one thing. I was having this conversation with my husband last night, is that what is interesting now is that once again, Black freedom struggles in this country, which is what is going on. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it is the center, it is the core of what people are rising up and protesting in this moment. But this call for Black liberation, Black Lives Matter, is also a container and sort of a conduit for so many frustrations of what I heard Cornel West say in an interview on CNN about America as a failed social experiment, right? America as a failed state in so many ways, a state that has not lived up to any of the promises that are supposed to be kind of sanctified in the Constitution, these promises that we're told that we all have from when we enter the school system, you know, liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all these things. And white students, I was telling my husband this, young white American middle class students are looking into the future and understanding that, you know, all of these promises that they were told, you know, that they would have, you know, a job waiting for them after graduation and a home and all these things. They're also seeing that going on in smoke, right? So that is kind of coalescing with their, you know, their generation's engagement with these issues of race and racism and police brutality, right? So that is what kind of, I think, you know, talking about a sea change, it is not just at this moment Black and brown people who are rising up and saying, wait a second, this is not working for us. This is also young, middle class, you know, working class white students who are saying, this is not working for us either. This is not working for anybody, right? So that is also something that, you know, I mean, I would, you know, I know the civil rights movement and all of the struggles of the 60s and 70s had these coalitions, right? But I think that feeling of helplessness and hopelessness is pervasive throughout American society now. And so you see kind of this 1%, these, you know, Jeff Bezos and all these people kind of hanging on and getting richer and richer and richer, and everybody else is watching in horror as this is happening, right? So that's also kind of a larger zeitgeist that I think is emerging in this moment.
I think it is. You know, I just reviewed a book by Muhammad Rahim Fraser. And in it, one of the telling things that had nothing to do with either COVID or George Floyd, but he was talking about the push by the immigrant Muslim community to erase African American Islam. And he details uh, certain aspects of what he sees as their plan. Now, right after I got this book and reviewed it, here comes this merger of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Um, and my first thought was, oh, this is interesting. People have not dealt with the psychic hurt, harm, or trauma of COVID-19 shut ins. And as soon as they get to stick one toe out of the door, the whole foot is grabbed toward protest. So then I looked out and I said, oh my goodness, this is a great example of how do you spur on herd immunity. Because they've decided clearly, Black, brown, and white, that their bodies are being acted upon in a way that they cannot control. So what the hell? Let me go and try to set something right about the system. I'm looking, I find it a wondrous time across the world because people are responding in the uh, Zoom meeting that the other Amina and I did yesterday. Women from Hong Kong were talking about folk they're protesting while at the same time continuing some patterns of racist behavior and discrimination. Here, there have been calls from, in Chicago, I'm talking about, and I'm sure in other cities, calls from um, the masjid. Well, can we get somebody to come talk to us? Well, nobody coming out. They're not willing to risk COVID-19 to tell you again the story of African American history. They'll send you a book. We're just a little bit, Maya Angelou had this saying of never waste your time on trying to explain who you are to people who are committed to misunderstanding you.
Mhm.
So it's like, no, no more. I've had enough of that. But I wonder, how would you as scholars begin to categorize, um, give us words to explain, analyze this merger of cultural stuff. And in a way, for black and brown people, it's not cultural stuff. It's a continuation of oppression. We get COVID, you don't treat us. We show up at the emergency room, you turn us away. Um, we already know from a history about health treatment that you're more likely to kill us than to treat us.
Mhm.
Okay. Now you want to continue a pattern, a wanton pattern of killing us, because now you can kill us on TV.
Mhm.
So, how would you, if school were starting actually in September, and I have no clue, I think it's fun to watch this stuff since I don't have to deal with it. Um, how would you begin to lay out for your students what is going on?
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, so I think this is such a difficult moment because as teachers, and I think if when I think about my work identity, of course I am also a researcher and I'm also a writer and filmmaker, but I really think that my primary calling in life is as a teacher, and so the people I most want to talk to are my students, and they graduated not the way they wanted to graduate, all alone in their parents' houses, and
Yeah.
no ceremony. And then a week later, we here we are. And so I have been in a lot of conversations with them. I had a white student from Chicago actually reach out to me and said, I'm trying. We had read Nasser Bufarha's The Making of a Human Bomb, which is about an ethnography of suicide bombers, or what's called suicide bombers, uh,
Hmm.
in Palestinian occupied Palestinian territories, and so she's using that text to explain to her parents why they should not talk about good protesters and bad rioters, and
Mhm.
Hmm.
writing me and saying, "Can you send me something for my parents to read about the history of looting and the radical political history?" And that kind of engagement, whether it's with indigenous or black or students of color of any kind, or whether it's with my white students, I mean that's where I feel I feel the urgency to act and respond. I also am struggling because I myself am trying to understand and absorb what's happening. It's happening in real time, and I'm an anthropologist, but I also have a part of me that does historical work, and Sylvia is a cultural historian. And sometimes going to the past is easier because you don't have that pressure of the moment to have an answer, of what the right thing to do is, or what the right thing to say is, or what's the right way to analyze this. I'm not sure. I'm still, I mean, so like I said, I would call this a biopolitical event. I would call Corona a biopolitical event. I would call 9/11 a biopolitical event. And what does that mean? That means that it's, what you've been saying, Dr. Amna, which is that, like, it's not that, the police violence is a political issue, it's a public health issue. COVID is a political issue and it's a public health issue. So bodies and politics aren't things that you can separate. Politics is not something that happens like ideas floating around in people's minds. It is with our bodies that we live out politics. So that's the kind of thing that I think is, I try to do to be somewhat helpful, or to get people to understand. And it is not that hard to understand that, look, the idea of the bad rioter is in fact supporting the criminalization of Black youth again, right? Uh,
Yeah.
all over again. So, in other words, if your way of support is still conditional on making a distinction between good protesters and bad rioters, then you are actually in that exact same moment discursively or in your words and ideas, reinforcing the idea of Black criminality on.
But we did the same thing with this explosion of terms to talk about Muslims in other countries who were fighting their idea, perhaps, of white supremacy, white occupation, European ideas taking over, thinking they're going to lose Islam. So we had this. I was having a hard time. It was Islamicist, Islamism. It was all of those words. Then there was another set of extremists and radical, and sometimes they would be with commas in the same sentence. And then I was confused, saying, "Oh, I want to be one of those." Now I don't know if I want to be one of those, but it was no reflection on how you characterize movements and their understanding of fighting for freedom. Do you see what I'm saying? If you look at it from another way, of course, nobody likes violence except when they're the perpetrators. But how, when fighting for freedom historically or contemporarily, does one characterize the shape that the fight takes? I don't know if I'm making any sense.
It's making perfect sense. I mean, Sylvia, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I was kind of talking about my sense of helplessness as as I'm trying to absorb myself of what's happening and how to think about it. But I do think this is a moment where we have touched upon the ways in which we as scholars have made mistakes. So one of sea change that I just want to recognize is I was part of a community conversation a couple days ago with Muslim ARC, and no one in the conversation, and there were Arabs. I was they see voice, and there were Black Muslims present as well, African American Muslims, and no one used the language popularized, I think, by Sherman Jackson and others, of immigrant and indigenous, because part of what you lose in that kind of talking about it is that, first of all, you're erasing indigenous Muslims who also, of course, exist and are separate, and that's separate from Black Muslims, which is what that term is often used to really mean. And then to talk about immigrant Muslims, that conversation was very much about corner stores in Black neighborhoods that are owned by immigrants, and what are those relationships like? To talk about immigrants, you suddenly had, I felt like, all these immigrant Muslims of color, Asian, Middle Eastern, and African, who live in the suburbs, interjecting their views in this conversation, which isn't really about them. And so you lose something like class, and then in that moment. And I think what I've seen different in that conversation, which was not led by academics, but I participated in it, is that organically you had people using a different language that is more precise, and I think precision always helps. And they're talking about Black, indigenous, people of color, making distinctions between people who live in cities, people who don't live in cities, and all the other kinds of nuance. So that's one way that I do appreciate the ways in which we are being more precise, because if we really want to solve these problems, we do have to be able to talk about them not all at one time, and to have the language to be able to kind of recognize specific issues, because the stakes are very different for Arab store owners in a Black neighborhood,
right,
their customer base, than they are for a doctor or the son of a doctor who suddenly feels guilty and wants to talk about how he should have confronted his parents more. I mean, that's another problem, but not part of this conversation. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, I've been having a lot of thoughts just about my own relationship to organizing and activism and teaching, right? So I come into the academy through a PhD program in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, and this is a program that came out of the Third World and Black Power struggles of the 1960s and 70s, where it was very much about grounding our relationship to history and our study and our scholarship and our teaching, centering the voices of people of color in this country and centering their histories and trying to craft ways of teaching and active engagement with communities as central to how we craft pedagogy, right? And so as I watched the protests, it really kind of brought me back to the fact that the very first protest I ever attended as a 17-year-old was again during the Rodney Kings, after the
Yeah.
Rodney King beating and the LA uprisings, right? And I took my daughters to a protest in Trenton the other day, a few days ago, and they really wanted to go and they were really inspired. So alhamdulillah, I'm so glad they got to experience that and be a part of it. However, I did find that I actually felt a sense of sadness, right, when I got home afterwards, and exhaustion that I had been protesting. I've been to many protests, organized many protests in my life over the last 30 years where these issues, continue to, be unresolved. And I spoke to, my friends, Sister Amina, I'm sure you can attest to that. My friend who reminded me, I've been doing this since '68, or whatever, and it's still unresolved. And so in terms of teaching, I teach a social justice class at Rutgers. I've been thinking about very long, the difference, as amazing activist and scholar Grace Lee Boggs says, the difference between rebellion and revolution, right? Rebellions
Talk about that.
Yeah, she says rebellions are important. They are an outburst of anger from the people. They are absolutely necessary for disrupting the order, right? And we have to remember, as we can see in these protests, the police are not, in many cases, protecting people. They are trying to protect order in the protection of property, the order, the hierarchical racial order of this society. They are protecting that. So disruptions of order are crucial, for kind of conveying to people the anger and the sentiments of the people. We must disrupt order for society to change. And that's what rebellions do. They disrupt order. But while rebellions are happening, while we are saying, no, we don't want this world, we don't want this state, we don't want this way of being anymore, we also have to have revolution. And how I understand that, and how I've learned, from spiritual and religious education, as well as the work of activists in this country, like I said, people like Grace Lee Boggs, is that we also have to transform ourselves, our societies, our ways of thinking, our ways of engaging and being in the world. And you mentioned, Sister Amina, the gardening, right? And this is actually, kind of how I came into this whole idea of thinking about food justice and growing and creating the communities, the sustainable communities that people of color, people who are living in urban environments, where you can have fresh food. So one of the ways in which the protesters are being kind of, they're not being allowed access to water and food as they're out in the street. What if we as networks and coalitions could provide that, could mobilize, right, to create fresh food? What about all the people who live in food deserts? So even as I see and completely support these rebellions, I also understand, and I teach to my students, that we also need to build these networks that of the world we want to see and live in. Right?
Well, let me play for a moment on both of yours historical understandings. I thank you for that explanation of definition, because I think defining and naming is very, very important. Now, we have looked back, if we were to look back at histories and use them as models, because we have to also simultaneously be thinking ahead. And we look at the Rigoberto Menchus. We look in Argentina and Cuba and other places. We're not facing some of the extremes, the disappearances, yet, the mass graves. Food and lack of it is a means of social control. Okay, lack of access to healthcare is also a means of social control. In this country, as opposed to other countries. And I think it must be frustrating for people who come from elsewhere. Class, although it is concretely there, is a well hidden kind of discussion. Um, People feel it, taste it, live it, but it's rarely discussed except the super rich. And there was what was that quick movement, the 99%, was
Oh,
it the 99?
Occupy.
Huh?
Occupy?
Yeah. And it was a flash in the pan. And one of the things a student said on TV, the other day, was, I hope this is not like Occupy. That it is sustainable. But once people move to provide what is lacking, don't you think that the government will stop you? Because you can't control when people are figuring out the loopholes and the gaps in your ability to control. Okay, you're going to make sure we don't have food. The other ring around the revolution or the rebellion says, got you. We'll provide the food and the water. We'll make sure, like in a marathon, every so often, you got people throwing bottles of water for you to catch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't you think that's going to happen next? Second question, where are we headed?
When you say we, do you mean we as a nation, we as Muslims?
As a society, Muslims in a society, because Muslims have not had a voice. Muslims have not done enough outside of their bubble to enter the fray of the general conversation, which is very interesting. Um, and will marginalize Muslims even further if they don't hurry up. And one of the reasons for Muslim Network TV is to get an alternative, but hopefully an alternative that is paid attention to, much like Democracy Now, space in the media world.
Mm-hmm.
So where are we headed? What we have students like my granddaughter who just graduated from college had all these plans. Well, I'm going to get this JD, PhD, and then the school is shut down.
Yeah.
What do they do? The uncertainty is killing them. They're watching TV, and the rebellion revolution is killing them. The fact that there's still coronavirus is killing them. And I can talk all day about herd immunity, which was my thing this morning. I said, oh, we have an instigator to herd immunity here. And, everybody just kind of looked at me. But where are we going? Because many of us sit back, we get a chance to reflect and think. Is it going to change the way we do scholarship? Will the three of us seize the moment and write now? Or we're going to continue our old patterns of, well, it takes me a year to get out a book. And whatever I was talking about, that moment has passed now. What are we going to do?
I just really quickly I had wanted to say this before, but as you said it, it just made me think about it much more. One of the things, and Zarina knows this, that, is sort of my kind of repeating point, is that I have, really feel very strongly that U.S. Muslim communities, especially non-Black Muslims, must engage and understand the history of anti-racist activism in this country, right? And they must understand it in a way that they see that they have benefited from it in innumerable ways, right? That they have benefited from the blood, sweat, and tears of Black and Indigenous and Latinx and organizing in this country, right? They actually stand on the backs of the people who have done this work. And so one of this kind of idea, or one of the movements, right? That is so critical, I think, to moving forward, that has been building these types of sea changes, is the prison abolition movement, right? This idea that we need to abolish prisons, not because, people always have these objections, well, where would the criminals go? What would we do if someone's really bad? No, what we need to do is envision a world where the conditions that create people, being impoverished, feeling as if they have no hope, feeling as if they're going to commit crime. We need to abolish those conditions. We need to abolish these conditions of inequality, of racism, of sexism, of misogyny, of violence, right? We need to abolish that, right? And to do so, we need to take our reliance upon the state structures that have perpetuated this violence historically. And it requires an analysis of race and racism and the history of how the law has enforced that in this country to do so. And I think the last thing I want to say, and I want, I always kind of think, in so many ways, immigrant Muslims still, and I don't mean to kind of immigrant Muslims, whatever, that's a really wide net, right? But I get so furious when I still hear in the community, sort of any language around the Nation of Islam or Black Muslims, who come out of the nation, kind of spoken with some sort of disparaging tone. Because I think about right now, the Nation of Islam was buying up farmland. They were understanding that they needed their own security, that they could not rely on the state for protection, that they were starting their own industry and businesses and doing all these things. And that is precisely, what communities of color know that we must be doing, right? We must be creating this, our own infrastructure. We should be buying land. We should, have our own protection, right? In this moment, we cannot rely on the state. So these are the types of kind of ways of thinking that, is emerging for me in this moment, and that I really, feel strongly about conveying to students, to community members. You just have to look at history. You have to look at what these communities have already done. They set up, systems that were responding to racism, just like we're still responding to racism now.
Okay, Zarina.
I agree with everything Sylvia just said, and also what she was saying before, what both of you were saying. I think I wanted to say a couple things. So yeah, and so I think, the abolitionist politics, the radical, kind of political agenda for really transforming the revolutionary agenda, as to just build on what Sylvia was saying earlier, is the future, and I really believe in it. And it's interesting, Dr. Amna, you said that Muslims are kind of outside of these national conversations. They are and they aren't. So, we know that Keith Ellison is now going to be the AG for this case.
But he's not an immigrant.
Oh, okay. Oh, we're talking about immigrant Muslims. Okay. That's
no, I'm just saying in general. Yeah, but he is one out of a significant number. That's pitiful.
So what when I say, when we look at something like abolition politics, so in Chicago, someone like Amina Matthews, or we look at the Miriam Kaba, who's of course the prison culture is her Twitter account. There are many Black Muslim women leaders, Believers Bailout. There are certainly Muslims contributing to this vision and leading in many ways, but collectively, as a collective community, of course, right, there's a disconnect, and we need to connect all the different parts of the community and get them invested in this political project. I do want to say though, just getting back to, it's funny, I was just talking to some friends in Greece, these are Muslim refugees and Muslim leftist activists who live in Greece, who they said in support of Black Lives Matter, they actually torched the U.S. embassy or did something like that. They're protesting, and one of the things that when I was in Greece was looking at was the ways in which to solve the homelessness problem, which was of course a longstanding problem, but became exacerbated by the refugee entry of all these refugees. There was they would take over abandoned buildings and build collectives there. That's happening right now in Minneapolis, right? We saw in Corona that this was suddenly, oh wait, the empty buildings can be used to house patients, and what
exactly
all these things become possible in this moment. So I don't think it's I think these are conversations that are pressing, that we all need to be having. And I also just want to say, these communities are, there isn't a Muslim community. As we all know, there are many Muslim communities. So in my own community in New Haven right now, there, people who are coming out of war are also have their own experiences. We want to elevate the experience of Black people in this country right now. That's so traumatic for them, but people bring all kinds of traumas to this moment. So even the category of Arab doesn't it operates as a racial category here, but like in my own community right now, there's a huge conflict between what we would call white-passing Arabs, refugees who are coming out of Syria and Yemen, other places, and refugees that are read in this country as Black, and they're having their own conflicts, and so that and their own.
But that's a good point that you bring it up, because what Black people are saying is, can't you for once stop focusing on the other conflicts and hear me?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, I know you want to talk about all the other conflicts, and I'm sorry for them, but nobody is listening to me in this moment.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems. It's not that we've forgotten, some would say, all those other conflicts.
No. What I'm saying is that for Black, for what we would call Arab refugees, but who are in the U.S. are read as Black bodies, they feel very much connected to what's happening, and that it also affects them as Black Arab refugees in this country. So the conflicts that are happening here are for the Syrians who are like, well, wait a minute, this is also hard for me, and it's exactly getting at what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The investments are not the same, and how do you take a traumatized population, Syrian refugees who are just coming from war,
Mm-hmm.
but also let them know that, look, it's not a race to the bottom, and this is what's happening right now, and you need to also understand that, yes, you experience trauma, but that you are also white passing more or less in this country, and that means something very different than for someone who is read as Black or lives as a Black person in this country. So that kind of really local conversation, I mean, I think that it's so there's many ways there's many different scales at which this is happening. So there's the national level, there's our internal in our communities, and in some ways it's good to be able to have Muslims can never have private conversations ever again, but
I swear.
But we do need to be able to deal with some of this stuff that the deep racial conflicts within our own communities, and with the store owner being Palestinian, in the Floyd cases, this is just one. This isn't like a shock to any of us that this could happen. This isn't the first case like this happen, but it's forcing all of us to reckon with, like, well, okay, well, what about our Muslim stores that we have tried to support in Corona? What is their relationship to the neighborhoods they exist in? We all can look at where we live and interrogate that and support better relationships and better practices. And that's not about and also to lift up the best models. Basil Mustry is a Black Lives Matter activist in Ferguson who was murdered. His father's store is 38 years and have been a site for radical Black radical activists and others to kind of get together, and he does all kinds of programming. He's about to go under. This is something, so we can both have that critique of what we've done wrong, but we should also nurture and support the people that are doing it right, that can be models for all of us and we can all learn from.
Okay, so we have to, unfortunately, but I will call you ladies again, stop here, and that can be a starting point for us next time. Let's look at what we can use as models going forward and get, make that a part of one of our primary pathways for going forward, because that is so important for the psyche. There is some good stuff happening. Let's jump on that wagon, and hopefully other wagons will be there for us to jump on. I have to say goodbye. God, we could talk to 3:00 this afternoon, but I want to have my producer send you the link to, right now we're live streaming this on Facebook, Facebook, which I don't watch. And so that you can pass the link along. Muslim Network TV hopes that we keep you as faithful listeners. There are a number of programs. Mine is Critical Talk. There are a number of other programs. Some are for children, some are far more spiritual. Uh, Lots of differences. Um, I will give my salams and my goodbyes. Have a great day, and thank you for spending a part of your day with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Salam alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.